Hello world, my name is Dr. Shaham Das and I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I live and work in London and I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders, or what the tabloids might call the criminally insane. I regularly assess defendants in courts, in prisons and in special secure units which are reserved for the most dangerous and violent patients. Although I specialise in criminal psychiatry, I also have expertise in most aspects of mental illness. And this video podcast series, A Psych for Sore Minds, explores a range of mental health topics, and it's designed for the layperson who might be interested in learning a bit more about severe mental illness, which includes hopefully you. So this episode is going to be about a TV series called 𝐨𝐬𝐲. So I was watching this with my wife a few days ago. I think it aired on ITV roughly about 4 weeks ago. And it's a 3-part series. And during the 3rd episode, I was just watching it and I just knew immediately that I felt compelled to make this podcast, because the legal issues that were discussed were exactly in my area of expertise. Not guilty by reason of insanity, diminished responsibility, for example. I have to say they got a few things wrong, and that's why I thought it'd be interesting to make a video from an expert to explain why. And I just want to make it clear that I'm not trying to be smug about this. I'm not criticising ITV for getting it wrong in any way, because these are actually quite complicated matters, and judges in criminal trials need expert evidence from experts. So in a perverse way, I'm kind of glad that they got it wrong, because it kind of justifies the need for somebody like me. It justifies my role. So in case you've not seen the programme, or if you want a little recap, if you have, Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and a necrophile. It actually occurred to me that I've never actually treated a case of necrophilia. It's probably the only offence that I've not ever seen, but there's still time in my career. So Dennis Nilsen, he murdered at least 12 young men between 1978 and 1983. And he died in prison in 2018. And this program, 𝐨𝐬𝐲, is a program about the aftermath of his confession. So it's about the police investigation, how they found evidence, and it's about the trial itself. Most of these murders were specifically committed in the area of Muswell Hill, which I used to live there actually until about 6 years ago. And the street where he murdered and buried many of his victims, Cranley Gardens, is very familiar to me. I used to take the bus past it on my way to work. So what Nilsen would do is he would lure in men. I say men, but I think his first ever victim was a 14-year-old boy, with the promise of either food or shelter or warmth or alcohol or sometimes sex, because he was gay, and his victims, some of his victims, most of them were gay. And then he would murder them by strangulation. And he would do all kinds of bizarre things, like put their heads in pots and boil them. And he would watch TV with the corpses for a while. Yeah, very strange. And what happened is he flushed some of the human bones down the toilet, and they blocked his drain, as you would expect. And he himself actually called his drain to be unblocked, and that's how he was discovered. And as it showed in the programme, he confessed fairly openly. So I generally enjoyed this programme. I thought it was really well made. It was very authentic 80s. They got the decor spot on, the environments, even the haircuts. And what I liked about it is it didn't glamorize Nilsen or make his murders gratuitous. It wasn't like the TV equivalent of clickbait. And it was acted exceptionally well. David Tennant played Nilsen. You always expect a high caliber from him. Daniel Mays played Officer J, the main policeman. At the risk of blowing my own trumpet, I think I can speak on these issues with some authority, because I've given evidence at the Old Bailey for murder trials before. The Old Bailey is where Nilsen's actual trial happened, and as far as I can tell, is where this programme was filmed, because all the corridors and the statues look very familiar. And I've given evidence specifically about not guilty by reason of insanity and diminished responsibility, which are some of the defences brought up in this episode. And so obviously, spoiler alert. Okay, that's enough of my spiel. Let's run some clips.
It's quite simple. I haven't spoken to my solicitors, my barrister, learned people from the psychology profession. I'm not sure if I'm guilty.
What, on what grounds? In all the months that we've been talking, you've not mentioned a plea of insanity once.
Not insanity, no. Diminished responsibility. Well, am I mad? I don't know. Madness, as 𝐾𝐲𝐡 said, madness is seeing life as it is and not as it should be.
You murdered those men, Des. And you knew what you were doing.
Did I? I don't deny taking their lives. You know, I must wear the label of a killer. Maybe I should be hanged for it. But I didn't plan them. Never. I took them home with much purer intentions, and then I'd wake up, they'd be sat there dead. Now, no one feels the weight of that more than me, but the power of responsibility at that time was nil.
So that clip that you've just seen was Dennis Nilsen talking to his biographer. And I think it's a foreshadowing of this entire episode and what I'm going to talk about in this podcast, because there's two completely different psychiatric defenses with different legal definitions that are getting mixed up. And this happens a few times in this episode. So there's not guilty by reason of insanity, which is a full psychiatric defense. So that makes the defendant completely not guilty in the eyes of the law. So in a case as serious as this, they wouldn't be just set free. They would go to a high secure hospital such as Broadmoor, and that can be run for any offence. And then there's diminished responsibility, which is what's relevant to this episode, which is only for murder. And that's a partial defence. So that downgrades murder to manslaughter. And also there's mention of pre-planning at some point, and that's a completely different concept to either of those defences, and it's not relevant to any of the psychiatric law.
Nilsen's not insane.
They don't have to prove that. All they have to do is show that he was suffering some abnormality of mind and therefore not fully responsible for what he was doing. We, on the other hand, have to prove that these crimes were carefully planned and premeditated.
Surely his confessions do that.
Okay, so this is a senior policeman talking to Officer J, who's the main policeman behind the investigation. And what he's saying, some of it makes sense and it's close, but it's not quite correct. Again, he's getting the two defences mixed up. So for diminished responsibility, the legal criteria is that the defendant was suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning, which arose from a recognised medical condition, which substantially impacted their ability to do any one or more of three things. That is, understand the nature of their conduct, form a rational judgment, and exercise self-control. And this law is from the 1957 Section 2 of the Homicide Act. The reason I'm mentioning the year is because the trial happened in 1983. So even though many of the laws have changed and moved on, this particular law hasn't. It's still valid. So to go back to some of that, you have to show that the defendant was suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning, whereas that policeman said an abnormality of the mind. And you might think they're the same thing, but actually, and there is a big overlap to be fair, but it's not quite the same thing. So for example, you could have a personality disorder, you could be quite depressed, or you could be paranoid. So those are abnormalities of the mind, but not necessarily abnormalities of your mental functioning, if you can still function and you can still form thoughts in a normal way. And also, really importantly, as I said before, it has to be from a recognised medical condition. So there has to be an actual solid diagnosis. And that's something that's skipped over in this episode. It's not even really mentioned at all, but it's probably one of the most important points for the court case. So in real life, I think Dennis Nilsen's diagnosis was disputed. Some psychiatrists thought he had a personality disorder, which is not the same as a mental illness. If you want to learn a bit more about that, then check out my podcast episode number 5. He was diagnosed by some with narcissistic personality disorder, which personally I would probably agree with. That's probably what I would diagnose him with. But other psychiatrists said he had no diagnosis at all. And then going back to that scene, the senior policeman says it was about whether Nilsen was responsible for his actions. And again, he's getting that mixed up with the insanity plea. So the insanity plea is that the defendant has to have a defect of reason caused by a disease of the mind. So he's not responsible for his actions, either because he didn't know the nature and quality, or he didn't know the act was wrong. So that's where being held responsible for actions comes in. But as I've said a couple of times now, that is not the defence we're talking about.
We gave you a lot of answers which prove what he did, but not what mind he was in when he did it. He gave you exactly what he wanted to. You hardly asked him any probing questions about what was on his mind.
Hold on. We didn't want him to suddenly stop talking. We needed to identify 15 people.
Okay, so this is one big area where I think the TV programme got it wrong, and I disagree with it. A policeman absolutely shouldn't be asking questions about a defendant's state of mind. That's solely the role of an expert psychiatrist only. So a policeman obviously has a very important role gathering evidence, but the different professions don't just interchangeably swap the different roles. Like a barrister doesn't suddenly go out and try and get evidence. Policemen are not experts in mental illness. And so, in fact, they're actually not allowed to give their opinions on mental state in court. And if a policeman did do that in terms of his evidence, then you'd hear the opposition barrister shout objection, and the judge would stop them because they would be incorrectly guiding the jury with their non-professional opinions. Now, obviously, I understand that this makes for good drama, and in this scene, it looks like some of the blame is unfairly being put on Officer J, so it makes it more interesting to watch, but just so that you know, it's factually incorrect.
Mr. J.
All that matters is that we find as much evidence as we can that Nilsen was in his right mind.
Now, what if he's insane?
You think he's insane?
Well, it's not for me to decide.
He's not mad. He knew what he was doing was wrong.
Well, I don't deny that. But at the same time, he was able to take the head of someone he'd known, the severed head, into a cooking pot on the stove and let it simmer overnight. And then the next morning, he was able to pour himself a cup of coffee and butter a slice of toast whilst turning up the heat to make sure that the head was boiling properly. Now that is completely mad.
So I know I'm repeating myself and I'm making the same point, but again, they keep making reference to whether he was insane, but that's a completely different defense. That's not guilty by reason of insanity, which, as I said before, would make him completely innocent of the crime. But we're talking about the partial defense of diminished responsibility. And even though there's a big overlap, it's actually nothing to do with whether he's insane. It's everything to do with those specific criteria that I mentioned before. Another interesting point is that the biographer said that what he did was such an extreme action, boiling this head in a pan, and therefore he must be mad. And that is a very common mistaken belief for lay people, but it's not actually the case. I suppose, to be fair, it depends how you define mad, right? If you define it as an inexplicable or very severe action that the vast majority of people such as you or I wouldn't do, then I suppose that you would find him mad or insane because he's done something extreme. But then anybody who does something extreme, like a terrorist or a paedophile, you could say was insane if you use that logic. And that's absolutely not the case. And it shouldn't be the case, because people should have responsibility for their actions if they actually were responsible. So if Nilsen was out of touch of reality, right? So say he was psychotic, say he was hearing voices that compelled him to cut off this head and boil it, or if he had some delusional beliefs about somehow he needed to do that to save this man's life, then that would be different. But he chose to do it. Even if most people wouldn't, he did. And that is not an indication of mental illness. So just to reiterate, doing something extreme, like cutting a head off and boiling it in itself, doesn't mean somebody's mad or psychotic. It's the reason that they did it. So if they did it just for their own entertainment or pleasure, like Nilsen did, it's very different to if they did it because mental processes or mental illnesses were controlling them and forcing them to do it. And to be honest with you, this is the absolute crux of the whole issue of the psychiatric defences in this episode. And also, it's the kind of the crux of what my job is as an expert.
Listen, if he can convince a jury that he was out of his mind somehow, then he only gets manslaughter. He goes to a hospital, and in 15 years he's been cured and he's back out on the streets. Is that justice for the victims and their families?
So again, I'm afraid this is technically incorrect. If it was not guilty by reason of insanity, which, as I keep saying, this episode is not exploring, then he would have to go to a hospital because he couldn't be technically guilty, so he couldn't go to prison. But if it was diminished responsibility, then his murder charge gets downgraded to manslaughter. And in that case, it's actually completely up to the judge what his sentence would be. So, for example, a judge might ask a forensic psychiatrist if Nilsen needed to go to hospital. I think most psychiatrists would say no, because he's clearly not acutely unwell now. Or the judge could choose anything from life imprisonment. Some judges could even release somebody with a charge of manslaughter. Where I've seen this personally has been like domestic violence cases where a victim has kind of lashed out in retaliation and killed somebody. So what Officer J said was wrong. It doesn't mean that he would automatically go to hospital. And to be honest, even if he did go to a psychiatric hospital, I think it's really unlikely that he would be released in 15 years. His discharge would actually be ultimately up to the consultant forensic psychiatrist who is in charge of his care. And because it's such a high profile, risky case, the Ministry of Justice might be involved. Now, obviously, I can't speak on behalf of this psychiatrist, but I can say that if it was my patient, I certainly wouldn't be discharging him after 15 years, or probably ever. And that's not a personal kind of moral judgment. It's just the fact that his risk is so unbelievably high that I don't think you could ever justify releasing him. And there's no rule or pressure to release him after 15 years.
I mean, we have a murder weapon, tie attached to a knotted rope.
Seems pretty preemptive to me.
Okay, good. What else?
We've got Duffy's knives.
Nilsen let him rust in his back garden so they could never be traced back to mine.
But that shows knowledge of wrongdoing, therefore criminally sane.
That's a stretch.
So actually, slightly ironically, what Officer J just dismissed there would actually be quite a strong point in this case. So if Nilsen let the knives rust so they couldn't be traced back, then if the defense team were going for a defense of diminished responsibility, then those acts might have actually proved that he was able to fulfill all those 3 limbs that I was talking about for diminished responsibility. So even if he did have an abnormality of mental functioning, which I don't think he did, and even if he did have a recognized medical condition, which again, I don't think he did, apart from personality disorder, if he was hiding and stashing the knives, then that shows he was able to understand the nature of his conduct. He was able to form a rational judgment, and he was able to exercise self-control. So even though it's a throwaway comment in this program, it's actually one of the few comments in the episodes that I fully agree with, and I actually think is very significant. Now, I just want to say on a completely random side note, I'd like to big myself up for calling the actor who uttered those words about the knife. His name's Doc Brown, not Great Scott, Doc Brown from Back to the Future, obviously. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he's a rapper and a stand-up comedian. He looks very different on Des because he's got longer hair and he's got a mustache. And I was watching this episode with my wife, and I just had this inkling that it was him, and I told her, and she thought it absolutely wasn't, because she reckoned the actor on the program was way too young to be him. But I insisted, so we Googled it, and I was right. And the funny thing about that is that one of the very first dates me and my wife went on 10 years ago was to see Doc Brown at one of his shows. So I'm glad to see that Doc Brown is getting some more work, doing some acting, although I would like him to have had a bit more of a bigger role in this program. Okay, roll the next clip, please.
Have you seen this man?
Yeah, on the news.
Yeah, his name is Dennis Nilsen. He killed 15 young men and attempted to kill 7 others. All of these men were strangled, mostly with a tie or a headphone cord. But one he tried to kill with a sleeping bag.
No. Because the man in my dream keeps telling me not to get caught up in the zip.
He also said he attempted to drown him before resuscitating him.
I've never told anyone about the water.
Do you remember the water?
Yeah. It was cold water, and I was being held down.
Where? In a bath or a sink?
I don't understand. Are you telling me that this actually happened?
Yes. I think you were one of Nilsen's attempted victims. Because everything that you are telling us aligns to what he told us.
So this is an interesting scene. During the investigation, Officer J goes to visit a man who you can see there was clearly traumatized, fragile, vulnerable. who he believes was one of Nilsen's victims of attempted murder. And this man apparently can't remember the incident at all, though he has the nightmares about it regularly. And again, I know this is done for dramatic effect, but it just doesn't ring true to me. There are sometimes in extreme cases, especially when people are very young, they can block out traumatic memories. This is known as dissociation, or suffering from a dissociative disorder, which is like a disconnection between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions, and like your core identity. And people with dissociative disorders escape reality in a way that's kind of involuntary and unhealthy. And it causes problems in their functioning in everyday life. But in reality, it's very unlikely to happen to a full-grown adult, especially with such a short period of time. I think that the time lapse between the attempted murder and Nilsen's trial is about a year, and usually memories fade over decades. So I did my own research, by which I mean I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it doesn't say whether this defendant, 𝐽𝐡𝐚𝐿 is his name, had this specific disorder, but I suspect that he hadn't. In reality, he didn't give evidence, as in the show he does give evidence, but in real life he didn't, because he couldn't be found. His whereabouts were unknown at the time of the trial. So again, I'm not dissing Des the programme. I know it's allowed to use artistic license for dramatic effects. I'm just saying, as a professional, I ain't buying it.
You are a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Hardy.
Correct.
Could you share with the court the clinical evaluation you made of the defendant during these many meetings? Did you find, for example, any evidence of mental abnormality?
Quite the reverse. I formed the impression very quickly that he was a highly intelligent man. In my view, Nilsen possesses an extremely rational mind. He's capable of feeling very deeply and concealing these feelings in order to preserve appearances.
Thank you. No further questions, my lord.
Dennis Nilsen killed perhaps 15 young men for no apparent reason. He kept their bodies, bathed and dressed them, watched television programs with them, conversed with them about those programs. You say you find no evidence of mental disturbance.
Of course, strangling people is not normal behavior.
While Nilsen was on remand, he made a series of protests and complaints about his treatment in Her Majesty's prison, Herne Hill. Would you not agree that this shows markedly paranoid tendencies?
Perhaps, in some cases.
And in this case, in fact, his behavior became so extreme, so erratic, that he was recently put down as a suicide risk. Could you tell us, Dr. Hardy, who the psychiatrist was who recommended this step?
I do.
So, would you not agree that someone at risk of suicide is, by definition, suffering a mental disorder?
I suppose in strict terms, that is true.
Thank you. No further questions, my lord.
Yes, of course, the pompous, posh psychiatrist. Right, it's been a total of 16 hours, 14 interviews. Thank you very much for that very familiar portrayal, ITV. Okay, so I've got a few things here. Firstly, the fact that Nilsen was complaining about his condition in prison in no way states markedly paranoid tendencies. In fact, the vast majority of people in prison complain about their conditions. If I was a prisoner, I'd probably complain about my conditions. But being paranoid is very different from that. That's, beliefs that people want to hurt you or kill you or are talking about you. And also, I just find it very odd that this psychiatrist would say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with the defendant if he himself had put him on suicide risk. I mean, you'd have to be pretty naive, and it's just a very obvious trap by the prosecution barrister that even a junior psychiatrist would not fall for. So all he had to do, any half-decent psychiatrist, would make the fairly simple point that even if Nilsen was at a suicide risk in prison now, after the offences, that's completely irrelevant to his mental state at the time of the killings. And that's not to say that some people who aren't floridly mentally unwell are at risk of suicide. They are. But suicide, self-harm is very common in the prison estate, especially now compared to back in the 80s. But also being on suicide risk is completely separate from paranoid tendencies. and, as is the case of Nilsen, completely separate from mental illness, such as psychosis that separates you from reality, hearing voices, etc. My other issue with this is that the forensic psychiatrist didn't look at the specific criteria for diminished responsibility. I mean, arguably he might have off camera, it just wasn't scripted into the program, but that's the main reason for his evidence. So what happened instead here, as it happened throughout the episode, is just random kind of naming of random symptoms that are vaguely connected to mental illness, as I said, without any specific diagnosis, which is crucial. So any psychiatrist or any person really can just randomly shout out symptoms of mental illness. But a forensic psychiatrist such as myself, we're able to accept or refute the medico-legal complexities of a potential psychiatric defense, such as diminished responsibility. That's the whole point of us being there. And they didn't show this at all in the program.
1 or 2 days. Did Nilsen keep you under duress?
No, but I was very confused and also in a lot of pain.
Did he, in fact, walk you to the tube station when you wanted to go?
Yes.
This supposedly cold and calculating killer, with every opportunity to finish the job, instead let you sleep in a warm bed for days before seeing you home safely. In fact, aside from the incident itself, did he not show you more care and kindness that evening than anyone else in your life had done for a very long time?
Yes. That's what I can't understand. Is he my murderer or my savior?
How peculiar that is. No further questions, my lord.
You may step down, Mr. Stoddard.
Right, I definitely need to speak about this. So I should emphasize that this is not a psychiatric point, so it's not something that I would comment on professionally in a trial, but I still have to call BS on it because it's just so ridiculous in my view. So here, the opposing barrister is cross-examining one of the witnesses, Carl, who was the victim of the attempted murder. And as I said before, in real life, he didn't actually give evidence, so this is obviously all make-believe. But basically, it doesn't really matter if Nilsen treated him well afterwards. I mean, I admit it is slightly, his pattern of behavior is bizarre and inexplicable, but it doesn't absolve him of previous guilt. I mean, the opposition barrister even said it himself. He said, aside from the incident itself. What do you mean? Aside from the whole attempted murder thing? It's kind of important in a murder trial, isn't it? So to give you a, admittedly, potentially facetious example, if a paedophile groomed a young child, you would never hear a barrister say in court, aside from the incident itself, he bought that young boy some candy floss, Your Honour. So he must have showed him some kindness. So yeah, I'm just not buying it. Anyway, next clip, please.
If you think, as we invite you to think, and as the evidence surely shows, that these crimes were not planned or premeditated, but were due to Nilsen's seriously abnormal personality and way of thinking, then you will find him not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter by way of diminished responsibility. That is the verdict which we invite you to return.
What's taking them so long?
See him again? We want...
So this brings up an issue that I've talked about before. So the prosecution barrister is trying to suggest that because what Mr. Nilsen did was so inexplicable and random and bizarre to most people, that in itself shows that he was not in his right mind. As I've explained before, it's more complicated than that. It's the reason that Nilsen did what he did. So if he did it for his own entertainment or pleasure, it's very different if he did it because he had a mental illness that was controlling him or forcing him. And, as I've said about the legal criteria, if it took away his ability to do one of three things: understand the nature of his conduct, form a rational judgment, or exercise self-control. You have to look at the legalities of it. The other issue that the prosecution barrister mentioned that's been brought up a couple of times in this episode is premeditation. And I think that's actually a bit of a red herring. Now, I'm not fully sure about this. I'm not an expert in this because it's a legal matter, not a psychiatric one. So I've never given evidence. But my understanding is that in English law, we don't look at premeditation, but we look at intent, which is kind of similar. If somebody had the intent to kill somebody, then that would be an indication of murder as opposed to manslaughter. But that's not the defense of diminished responsibility. That's a different defense that makes murder to manslaughter. So on the surface, you might think that premeditation and mental state are connected. And you might arguably say that if somebody did premeditate or pre-plan an incident, then that shows that they weren't suffering from abnormality of mental functioning, right? I would say wrong, actually. I don't think it's that linear or that simple. So I'll give you an example. I once gave evidence in a case, although it wasn't actually a murder case. In fact, I discussed this in episode 1 of A Psych for Sore Minds, where the defendant had been completely psychotic, but they still pre-planned their offense. So this was a man with schizophrenia who was suffering from like hallucinations and delusions. And he was convinced that his ex-girlfriend was being tortured in a flat he used to live in, and he was hearing voices as well. So he went down to his old accommodation, he kicked the door in, and he freaked out the old man who lived there, and he was eventually arrested. But later in court, he did get the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity because of the evidence I gave. But this is the important bit. He did plan the event. He took public transport there, he planned the route, he took tools with him to break in. So this is an example where you can still be mentally unwell or insane, as the law would call it, but you can still be planning an offence.
A defense psychiatrist said Nilsen acted as if he were the judge judging this case of an infamous crime. He shows off. He really believes he is the most important person of the century. The defense expert found another way of describing Nilsen's mind. His personality was like his house. It looked perfectly all right from the outside, but perhaps there was something of a funny smell about it.
What? I have to say, out of the whole episode, this is the bit that grates me the most. I'm not sure if this is an actual quote from the real-life defense psychiatrist evidence, but to me, it's just really vague and unprofessional. I mean, we're expert witnesses. We're supposed to inform the court about issues related to psychiatry. We're not poets. What did he say? His personality is like, it's like his house, and there's a funny smell, and you might find something under the floorboards. That's just really vague. It's not helpful at all. Our job, like all doctors, is to be as clinical and as exact as possible. So number one, we need a diagnosis. And number two, the most important thing is we need to look at the very strict medico-legal terms and see if it applies to the defendant, whether they've got the grounds for the psychiatric defense or not. And it has to be done like objectively, accurately, professionally. We're not allowed to just make it up as we go along. So I suppose if this psychiatrist had already outlined all of the things that I mentioned, and then this was like an afterthought comparing his personality to his house, then that would, I suppose, just about be acceptable. But even then, it's just a bit, it's a bit pointless, isn't it? It's not clinical, not scientific. It just sounds like the psychiatrist is trying to show off. I would never write anything like that in one of my reports. It's just a random bit of poetry for me. So aside from that bit, the poetry, random poet psychiatrist, and aside from the bit where the defense barrister said, aside from the incident itself, Nilsen treated you well, those are the only bits of the episode that really kind of annoyed me. The rest, I think, were fine. Even when there were mistakes made, they were reasonable, even if they were technically wrong. Plus, obviously, I'm aware that this program, 𝐸, is just based on real life events. It's an ITV drama. It's not a documentary. I get that. So they've got artistic license and they're there primarily to entertain. I don't think they're obliged to get all the legalities and technicalities correct. So just to be clear, this video is to educate people that might be interested in all the medico-legal issues behind it. It's not to criticize this program. So before I finish, I'd like to reiterate the new good news that we've had recently, which is that A Psych for Sore Minds is going to be on CrimeCon UK on the 12th and 13th of June next year in London. It's a huge convention for true crime fans. It's massive in the States, and now they bring it over to the UK. So please get your tickets. If you use the code PSYCH, you can get a 10% discount. So on to next week's podcast. It's going to be an interview with a man with a fascinating story. He's called John Clark. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder through the line of duty of being a police officer. And I'm going to interview him, hear his fascinating story, and then talk you through the diagnosis and about how symptoms of PTSD can impact the sufferer. I'm also open to suggestions. So if you've got anything that you'd like me to talk about, if you're listening or watching this, if you've got any issues, please get in touch. If you want to ask me any questions about life from the perspective of a psychiatrist, hit me up. So I'd like you all to please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and submit an episode idea on our email address, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. And if you're going to reference us, use hashtag #PsychSore. I'd love to get the numbers up, so please spread the love. Tell people about this podcast, A Psych for Sore Minds. Okay, until next time, stay euthymic, homies.